Hi, I'm Simon Drew, and you're listening to the Practical Stoic Podcast. If you'd like to find more episodes of the show, as well as articles and information about my one-on-one alignment coaching, then you can head to my website. It's simonjedrew.com. If you do have the means to support the show, then I'd love to see you in my Patreon community. Just go to patreon.com/simonjedrew, where you'll also get access to over 240 episodes recorded before 2020. But for now, enjoy the show. Hey everybody, thank you so much for spending your time with me here on the Practical Stoic Podcast. Now, something you've noticed probably over the past few months is I've been really interested in diving into this idea of living in agreement with nature, which is, you might say it's the Stoic Theology, it's the Stoic metaphysics, it's this really deep idea of how do we connect ourselves with everything that is. And you know, I've been so fascinated with the theology of Stoicism, trying to figure it out, and not just figure it out for what we have in the texts, but to figure out the spirit of the theology of the philosophy, you know, and how can we overlay that over today's society and today's current beliefs and values. And so it's such an interesting avenue to go down. But today's guest really, you know, when I had this conversation, he just pushed me over the line and made me think this is something that I really need to dedicate myself to, because I don't know if you can divorce the theology of Stoicism from the general philosophy of Stoicism. And so anyway, our guest today is none other than the Associate Professor from the Norwegian School of Theology, Religion and Society, Glenn Wehus. Now, Glenn was recommended to me by Harold Kavli, one of my former guests as well. And I'm so grateful that he recommended Glenn to come on the show, because this was just such a fascinating conversation for me. And I know that you guys are going to find so much value in it. And I'm really fortunate enough as well that this was Glenn's first major appearance in the Stoic community on a podcast. And so really, really grateful that he came on the show and shared his wisdom. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about him before we jump into the show, but his main scholarly interests are related to the cultures of the ancient Mediterranean world, including the Greek language, both as a language system in itself and as a tool for understanding the theology of the New Testament. Another main interest is the philosophical traditions of these ancient cultures, in particular Stoicism and the Stoic teacher and former slave Epictetus. In general, he is fascinated by the points of contact between language, history, theology, religion, geography, and social aspects, the complex matrix which together makes up what we call culture. So that's a little bit more about Glenn, and I'm going to put links in the show notes to where you can find his stuff online. But sit back and enjoy this really fascinating discussion with Professor Glenn Wehus. Glenn, I'm really excited to have you here today, as you know, and I just want to, from the start of the show, give you an opportunity. If you just want to introduce yourself, tell myself and the audience when they listen to this who you are, what you do, and before I get you to do that, I also want to thank Harold Kavli for recommending you as well, because he has been on the show a couple of times, and he gave you a massive recommendation. So I'm so excited to talk to you. But yeah, who are you? What do you do? And how did you get interested in Stoicism?
My name is Glenn Wehus, and I'm associate professor teaching primarily New Testament or Ancient Greek at a theological school in Oslo called MF, Norwegian School of Theology, Religion and Society. So I teach primarily language, the Greek language, but I use that language as a door pathway into the Greek philosophical culture heritage broadly. So through my teaching on the Greek language, I try to introduce my students not only to the New Testament, but also to the Greek philosophers, primarily Stoicism, but also Platonism, Aristotelianism, and the other schools, but primarily Stoicism. And I want to show them that the Christians didn't, since I teach primarily students of theology who are going to become ministers in churches in Norway, I want to try to show them that Christianity didn't arise in a vacuum. It arose in a context where they were surrounded by thinking and searching people, primarily Stoics. So I'm very interested in the crossovers between Christianity and Stoicism.
Yeah, wonderful, and I'm very excited for this conversation, because that's exactly what I'm trying to figure out at the moment. And you know, what does amaze me is even just reading the Bible and then reading Stoicism, looking at the crossovers in the ideas, you know, the philosophy of both, both Stoicism and also of the Bible is just wonderful. You know, there's so many excellent crossovers there. And I wanted to start by asking you, so a lot of people, including myself until recently, don't really understand even what theology is. And we don't often talk about the theology of Stoicism. And so, you know, it's not really, it's kind of something that, yeah, until recently I didn't understand what it was, but I'd love for you to, you know, give your own definition. What is theology, and why is it important?
Yeah. Theology in Stoicism, I agree, it has in a way been overlooked, but it is very basic for ancient Stoicism. In a way, theology is everything in ancient Stoicism. It is present everywhere in Stoicism, not always visible to see, but ingrained in the very structure of Stoicism. There is a conception of God, a kind of ultimate being. When I teach my students about ancient, who are primarily Christian students, trying to learn about the New Testament, I have to help them to see that the Stoic view of God is a very different view of God, even though it has so many parallels, at least in wording. But the conception is very different, because in Stoicism, God is the name which the Stoics put on this ultimate rational principle, which has made and ordered and structured everything we see around us, even ourselves. So God is a very elastic term for the Stoics. God, in a way, is the same as reason, which in Greek is logos, and is the same as nature, which is physis in Greek. And in a way, God is also destiny, and it is providence. So God is a name which can be bent and stretched in all the directions. But the basic thing is this notion of something which is responsible for the character and the shape and the structure of everything we see around us. So in that way, God is omnipresent in all of Stoicism. He's the forming principle over everything. I don't know how technical we should be, but the Stoics divide on the most basic ontological level. That they divide the world into two categories: the structuring principle, which gives shape to everything, which is then God, the reason, which is the active principle, and the other principle is the passive principle, which is the material aspect of reality. So what God does, what the active principle does, is to impose his structure on the passive principle, on matter, and shaping it to becoming an actual entity. So every single entity in the world, we as human beings, the animals, the trees, and water, etc., are basically on the utmost ontological level to be described as a combination of an active and a passive principle. And this active principle, as I said, is God. So in that way, God is present in every single human being, because God ultimately is the one responsible for us being the kind of species that a human being is. In the same way that God is responsible for the animals being the kind of species they are, because as the rational principle, he has ordered and structured everything. So that is the very basic ontological notion of what God is. It's the rational principle. But I guess we will go into more details soon about how, for example, the Stoic, which I have worked most on, Epictetus, from the 1st century CE, how he views this God, because he is among the Stoics who speak very intimately and personalistic about this God. Not all Stoics do that. Many Stoics speak about God as a kind of not detached, but at least a purely rational principle. But Epictetus and some other philosophers in the Stoic tradition have a very intimate, personal way of speaking of this God. They actually love this God and cherish him higher than everything, as a kind of personal relation.
Mm. And you know, reading your article before this, you actually quote Epictetus a couple of times in there. And one of the passages that you quoted from, you know, I was reading it and I was like, wow, you know, Epictetus almost seems evangelical in the way that he's teaching that we should communicate or allow ourselves to be in communion with this, you know, Stoic God or nature or the Logos. What I'm interested in is, to what extent did somebody like Epictetus rely on that communication or that connection with the Stoic idea of God? Because, you know, in Stoicism at the moment, especially in Western culture, I would say, obviously there is the kind of view that, you know, we don't need the theology of Stoicism anymore. It's kind of outdated. You know, we can purely see it as rationality. But yeah, I'd love to know, for someone like Epictetus, what was the relationship? How important was it to his overall teaching?
That is a very good question, and I guess the scholars would differ on this topic. Epictetus, as I said, has a lot to say about God. He speaks about God all the time, and not all the Stoics do that. But he is one of those Stoics who speak most about God. And he ties into a tradition which goes back to Cleanthes, the second head of the Stoic school, and then we're back in the early 3rd century BCE. So Cleanthes also spoke about God much in his writings and in his teachings. But then we seem to have a long stretch in the Stoic tradition where God, as you say, becomes more this purely rational principle. But Epictetus, he reverts to this more personalistic view of God, which also we have in Cleanthes, and he goes much, in a way, also much further. So Epictetus speaks to God, he thinks about God, he writes about God, and God is present everywhere in what he has to say. As you mentioned, I wrote an article about the prayers in Epictetus because he includes many prayers in his writings, and in those prayers, he divides his prayers into, as I divide his prayers into legitimate prayers, what prayers a Stoic is entitled to or should pray, and also prayers which a Stoic should not pray. And Epictetus, when he prays to God, he prays to a God which is very dedicated to the project of becoming the person you are meant to be. So to Epictetus, God is a very supportive God, not a detached God, not a disinterested God, but a very supportive God, which has given him and every other human being the resources available or necessary to become the person you were meant to be. So prayer for Epictetus is primarily to thank God for all the resources he has given to a person to become the ideal of what he was supposed to be. And a kind of prayer which you should not pray to God, according to Epictetus, is complaints. You should not complain to God that your life is in this or that circumstance, because God has given you the resources to handle all those different circumstances. So God is a supportive God. He has given you all you need, and he has given you your mental capacity, your rational identity to handle the difficulties you may encounter. And then we could, of course, ask, what is Epictetus's basic notion of this God ontologically? Is he really an external God, which actually can intervene in a person's life and help him? Some scholars, perhaps Christian-oriented scholars, have interpreted Epictetus to saying something like that Epictetus visions an almost a Christian external God, a creator God, which can intervene. But myself, and I guess most other Stoic scholars, tend to see that Epictetus' view of God as basically in line with ordinary ancient Stoicism, seeing God as another word for the immanent structuring rational principle in reality. But what makes Epictetus stand out is the way he speaks about this immanent rational principle, because he uses language which is much more personalistic, much more intimate than almost all of the other Stoics. So in terms of language, he comes very close to describing God as an external, benevolent father figure who actually can intervene and help people in their struggles. I don't think he actually has that view, but his wording when he speaks about God has that tone, this very personalistic, intimate tone.
Yeah, and when you read the stuff that he talks about, when he talks about prayer, and like I said earlier, it almost seems evangelical, because he literally says in that passage, for once in your life, I can't remember the exact words, but it was almost like relinquish control, look up to the heavens and scream out, hey, and that's so interesting to me, is the relationship that Epictetus fostered with this, whatever it was, that he was talking about. And when we talk about prayer, it kind of sounds as though what Epictetus is trying to say is, ask God not to intervene, but to allow you to use the resources at hand to the best of your abilities, right?
Yeah. I think that is basically what he sees as the legitimate way of a Stoic to go about praying. Not asking for an external intervention, because I don't think he has actually sees God as an external God. So he's not praying for an intervention. He's praying in a way, and I make that point in my article. His prayers are a kind of self-admonition, self-pedagogical way of spurring himself on in the correct direction, but addressing himself to God, seeing God as a kind of supportive asset on the way. But this God is basically nothing else than the resources laid down in him by nature. So it kind of in a way, it's a kind of self-prayer. It is addressed in wording to an external kind of external God, but basically it's a kind of self-prayer, admonishing himself to become the person he was meant to be, and to use the resources which nature and God has given him.
Yeah, no, that's so interesting, and I'd love to know what is the relationship between his core principle of the dichotomy of control and that relationship of man and nature, because for the past few months, as I've really thought about that idea, I've kind of begun to think that too often we focus so much on the, I can control this part. So we focus a lot on, I can control that, so I'm going to control it and I'm going to crush it. But I actually think that there's such an important element of relinquishing control of everything that you can't control, right? Because if you really think about it and you go into the depths of your own mind and you try to think, well, what is that one thing that I can control? I mean, it gets pretty deep pretty fast, and there's not much in there that you can control. So what I'm interested in is what was the relationship of the dichotomy of control to the theology of Stoicism, and is there an importance there of actually relinquishing control to what is nature's job to control, and of actually just focusing on the one gift that we have, or the spark of divinity from nature that we have, which is rationality? Sorry, I hope that question makes sense.
For Epictetus and for all the Stoics, but especially for Epictetus, the benevolence of God primarily shows in the way God has structured everything, because God or nature or reason has to Epictetus divided all of reality and all of human existence into two basic categories. And as you mentioned, it is what is up to us, what we can control, and what is not up to us. That is all the things which we cannot control. And up to us, what we have under our principal control, is to Epictetus only our preferential choices, our value system. So we can decide what and how we want to respond to everything that happens around us and to us. So our value system is under our control, and completely and solely under our control. But everything else is, to Epictetus, principally not under our control. Our wealth, our health, our family, our freedom or slavery or social political standing, all these categories are principally not under our control. And this Epictetus sees as an aspect of the benevolence of God, because that means that the categories of good and evil are solely up to us, because the Epictetus good and evil does only concern what is up to us, our ethical values, our value system. So no one can, and he says this right outspoken, only I myself alone can procure myself any good or get myself involved in any evil. But for all the rest, I am kind of at haphazard. I can always lose my income. My family can die. I can get ill. So all these things are principally not under my control. But that does not affect my dignity as a human being. My dignity as a human being is solely how I respond to all these external incidents. And that, with Epictetus, to many moderns, that sounds very, very defensive and very kind of brutal philosophy. But to Epictetus, this is an aspect of the benevolence of God, because this. And here we have to remember where Epictetus comes from. He was a slave, grew up as a slave in Rome. So he has seen and experienced on his body what it means not to have control over his own body, his family, his friends, and his reputation. All that is under the control of his slave master. So we have to have in mind where Epictetus comes from. And that means that this structuring of God in these two categories, what is up to us and not up to us, is for Epictetus an expression of the benevolence of God. He has made it possible, even for a slave, to live in dignity, no matter what he is being, the strain he's being put under by his slave master. He can always respond by keeping his self-dignity, even though his master does not keep his self-dignity. So Epictetus as a slave explains a lot, I think, to why he cherishes this dichotomy of what is up to us and what is not up to us, and he loves this distinction. This is his gospel. This is when I try to speak to my students of Christian theology, I speak about the Christian gospel. Then I try to show them that there's also another gospel in ancient philosophy, and this is the gospel of Stoicism, which the slave Epictetus has found as his path to freedom, his path to an authentic human life. And theology, how God has structured reality, is for him the basic of this gospel.
Mm. Yeah, and I'd love to jump into that, the kind of connections that you see, the differences that you see between the Stoic theology and the Christian theology. And I want to also kind of give people some definitions here as well, because I think that that's important. You know, especially somebody from, say, Australia or someone from America, we have a very different view of God because we've only been shown one side of the Christian sphere. You know, it's like we only really know a little bit. And so for a lot of people in America, for example, if you say God, they're immediately going to think of all of the aspects of Christianity that they dislike. And they're going to think of all of the prosperity gospel preachers. And they're going to think of, you know, all of these hypocrites. And, you know, that's not what we're always talking about here. There's so many different definitions of God, which is why when we're talking about Stoicism, I often say nature, because that's kind of what they wanted us to live in agreement with. And it's interchangeable. But can we also just talk quickly, what is your definition of theology as a study? Because one thing that I read the other day, which was just so beautiful, is they used to see theology, they said, I'm going to butcher this, but they said that theology was the mother of all sciences because it was discovering, you know, the origin of everything. And philosophy was her handmaiden, right? So philosophy and theology go hand in hand. But what is theology when somebody comes to your class and they have no idea what it is? What do you define it as?
Yeah. Most of the students coming to my class
obviously they already know.
so they have a Christian understanding of theology. But I think you're right. Theology for the Stoics would be the searching out of the very fundamentals of everything that exists. So theology is, you don't go any deeper than theology for the Stoics. That is, and some of the ancient Stoics had actually theology as the final and last point on their curriculum, because that was the kind of the essence, the crowning of it all. You learned about nature, and you learned about man and ethics and logic, and then finally came theology, which encapsulated everything, putting everything into place. So you may well use that broad definition of theology. Theology is searching out the depths of everything that exists. And I guess also a Christian would subscribe to that definition, because for a Christian, of course, God is the ultimate source of everything that exists, and has and His will is the reason for things being in existence at all.
Yeah. So I appreciate you kind of defining that for us. And I find that really fascinating. And when I finally learned what theology actually is, I was thinking, man, you're right. You can't go any deeper than that. It's like you can't go deeper than, because it goes beyond what science currently understands, and it tries to understand the limits of what we know. And I think that what's so helpful about that idea for me and for a lot of people is being able to accept that there is so much that we don't know, and that we almost can't even know, right? There's so much that is limiting us in our understanding. And if we imagine just for a second that we are the most powerful, the most knowledgeable things on this planet, I mean, that's just not true. Like there's so much that is bigger than us. And so, yeah, what do you see as the similarities and the differences between the Christian theology and Stoic theology, as if we can sum that up in one answer? But
I guess the most basic difference is that in the biblical tradition, the Old and New Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures and the New Testament, God is clearly pictured as an external God, something different than the rest of existence. He existed before anything material existed, and He is the one responsible for everything that exists, but He is not as Himself a part of the physical world. That is the main difference to the Stoic view, because in Stoicism we don't have this kind of dualistic view of reality, God on the one hand and the physical world on the other. The Stoics are monistic. They're monists. Everything basically is one. So when you spoke about the active and the passive principles at the start of our talk, these two principles are in a way only to be divided in our conceptions and in our mind. Basically, they are one, because also the active principle is a kind of material principle. God is in a way not an immaterial spiritual category for the Stoics. He is matter in its most fine and nuanced way. So for the Stoics, God is not something different from the physical universe. He is present there within everything. Some would say that it is pantheism, others would say that it is panentheism, with aspects of theism, if your viewers are familiar with that, with those terms. But it is at least not dualistic in the Christian tradition. So that is the big difference between a Christian and a Stoic view of God.
Yeah. And so it's basically, to a Stoic, everything is one, including you and me, and we have sparks of that divinity within us. And that's another question I want to get to later as well. But then for Christians, it's obviously God is separate to everything here, and obviously plays a larger role in making things work, or intervening, you might say. So sorry, go on.
Yeah, and that is what we just to revert to the topic of prayer again. This basic difference in the theology also plays out, of course, in the difference between Christian and a Stoic view of prayer, because in Christianity or in the New Testament and also the Old Testament, people, of course, pray to this external God, hoping that He would intervene, and often He does, and sometimes He does not. But they hope that He will intervene and do something in the physical universe that He has created, but of which He is not Himself a part. But of course, in Stoicism, there is no external God. So the one you pray to is basically the aspect of God which is inside yourself, the resources which nature or God has put in you. So the topic of prayer actually is a very interesting topic, because there the differences, the practical implications of the theology becomes very obvious. How are you supposed to relate to this God? And prayer is a very fascinating topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when it comes to prayer, I'd like to understand the way that. So am I right in saying that for Christians, a prayer, or at least in the theology of Christianity, a prayer is very much a call for God to intervene in one's life, whereas for the Stoics, the prayer is is it almost like for God to continue doing things to make everything work, however, to allow you to be the most rational player in the game of life, right?
Yeah. I think so. I can use a very famous Christian prayer, which I think many of the listeners will be familiar with, which is sounded in the Christian service every Sunday, which is the Kyrie eleison. The phrase "Lord, have mercy," which is a quotation from the New Testament. The sick people who meet Jesus shout this prayer to Him: "Lord, have mercy." And this is a kind of epitome of what the whole New Testament gospel is all about. The New Testament gospel is about a God who wants people to come to Him and shout out their distress, hoping that He will intervene and expecting that He will intervene, because He has promised that He will be a God who does actually intervene and who wants to intervene on people's behalf. So Kyrie eleison, this prayer, is the kind of core message of what Jesus came to tell humanity. God is interested in your distress. And interestingly, Epictetus, he has the same phrase. And I'm pretty sure that he does not have it from the Christians, even though he knows about the Christians. He does not seem to have any familiarity with their writings or with their core doctrines. So I don't think he has this phrase from the Christians, but he uses the same phrase. But to him, the Kyrie eleison, shout, is something which a Stoic should not say to God. There is no reason for a Stoic to shout, Lord, have mercy on me, to God, because God has given you the resources to handle your life without uttering those kinds of distressful words. So God is the one who has made the Kyrie eleison shout superfluous. You don't need that shout anymore, because you, as you also mentioned, every single person is a fragment of God. Epictetus uses that phrase. You have it in you, a fragment of God. You have all the resources available to handle your life, and don't need to shout your distress to God.
So if there's no need to shout distress to God, is prayer for the Stoics almost like a meditation, going inwardly to yourself? Like, it's not necessarily asking for anything, it's just an opportunity for you to pause in the moment and learn more about yourself.
Yeah, that is exactly how I look at on prayer in Epictetus and the Stoics in general. It's kind of meditation. You speak to God, but actually what you do is to meditate on the basic truths about how God has structured everything. So you are admonishing yourself to live by the principles which God has laid down in nature. And Epictetus, he has several rather beautiful examples of prayer, of what he sees as a legitimate prayer by a Stoics. Just to take one example, he says to his students he tells the student what he hopes he will be able to say to God in prayer on the day he is going to die. So in a way, he transposes himself to his deathbed, and he says to students, "This is what I hope that I will be able to say to God when I die." And then comes this prayer, and it goes something like this: Have I ever used my mind or my rational principles to something which I was not supposed to use them? Have I ever complained to you about my circumstances? Have I ever sought things which were not under my control? Have I ever any time opposed you? And of course, the answer to all these questions is no. I've never done that. And then he goes on to become rather personal. And he says, I became sick and ill when it was your will. But and also other people did that, he says, but I did it on purpose, voluntarily. So he accepts what life gives him, and he sees it and interprets it as given by God. Also illness, which he himself experiences, is interpreted as given by God. And that is something which befalls everyone, but he says, I received all this willingly. And that is very important. That is the whole point. He is not a slave anymore who has to suffer things involuntarily. He is a free Stoic philosopher who accepts his destiny willingly. So even illness, which we see as something cruel and bad, even illness, he leads back to God as something God has given, but he doesn't see that as something which he should complain to God about. He sees it as something that God has given him, but also given him the resources to handle that illness.
Yeah, this is super fascinating stuff, because I've also experienced this kind of talk in, say, Meditations, Marcus Aurelius. He very much, there's a lot of passages in there that I only really began to understand recently, where he's talking about, just the superficial nature of attaching yourself to anything in this lifetime. It's like, imagine the vastness of time, and you've got this tiny little slither, and you think you're going to make a big difference in the way that things go, right? And he talks about, you haven't got long to free yourself. And that actually was a revelation to me, what you just said there, this idea that truly becoming free to somebody like Epictetus was almost understanding that you are. Well, what did Epictetus talk about when we discuss the idea of like you and me? So what am I, and what is it to say that? Let me phrase this question in a way that is going to be understandable for the audience and for yourself. What is me and what is I to the Stoics? Is it the soul? Is it the connection with the soul and the body? Is it God? What is it when they talk about you or me?
Yeah, Epictetus, to focus on him, he is among the Stoics who go the farthest in dividing the I or a human being between the soul, which he then sees as the real I, and the body. He uses very dualistic and dichotomic language in describing the soul versus the body. He doesn't picture the body as something negative, which some other ancient traditions of thought did, but he has a very rough language when it comes to the unimportance of the body, and he has been criticized for that many times, and at least the last 50 years many academics criticizes Epictetus for this negligence of the body, and his belittling of the pain and sufferings which ancient slaves experienced on their bodies. So to Epictetus, as you say, the I, the me, is primarily the soul, and the Stoics divided the soul in different parts again. And the really important part of the soul was the leading part, which in Greek is the hegemonikon, which means leading. So, and that is basically your reasoning faculty. But this reasoning faculty rules over everything that takes place in your soul. Also, your senses are ruled by your reasoning faculty. So that means that everything you experience should be and always is put under the supervision of your rationality. So yes, you're basically right. I think for Epictetus, the I is basically your rationality. But this rationality, even though it is made by nature and in that way is kind of perfect, it needs to be trained. It always needs to be trained. So this I, this soul is never perfect. It always needs to be led in the right direction, to be formed, to be in progress. So many other of the ancient Stoics, they talk about the ideal wise man, the ideal sage, the sophos. Epictetus, on the other hand, does not talk very much about this ideal sage, this sophos. He talks about all the rest of us, our ordinary people who are striving to progress, to become gradually better. So he has much more advice to give to the rest of us, the humanity at large, and he does not speak about so much about the ideal few who actually reach the goal. I guess he doesn't see that the goal is possible to reach. He uses Socrates and Diogenes, the cynic, as his two philosophical heroes, and they, in a way, have reached that kind of goal. But he himself is only progressing, trying to become better each day.
And I didn't even realize how much of a absolute almost like a godlike figure somebody like Diogenes was, until I actually started reading about his life and learning about how even Alexander the Great said, if I wasn't born Alexander the Great, I would have loved to have been born Diogenes. And to be the kind of person who can just give up everything and still be happy. But even that idea of being that person who gives up everything in order to find true eudaimonia, that's an idea that's in the Bible as well, right? Like, in order to be a Christian, you need to be willing to give up everything. If you're willing to give up everything, that's when you receive that kind of revelatory power, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that what you point out now, the ethics of Stoicism and Christianity, that is where these two traditions actually meet the most. They do not meet so much in the theology, because as we spoke about, they have very different views about what God actually is, but they meet more fundamentally in their view of how a person should lead his or her life in ethics. What are the true values of a human life? Is it the material values, or is it the spiritual or ethical values? And the Stoics and the Christians definitely agree it is the ethical values, what you do to yourself and what you do to others. So ethics is really the point where Christians and the Stoics had common ground in the early centuries. And as you say, the also for the Christians, to give up everything is something you should be willing to do in order to gain the salvation of Christ, not to be held back by these imagined values of wealth and property and so forth, but to be willing to give up everything to obtain this single most value. The gospel of Christ.
Yeah. And I'd love to talk about the ethics and the virtue side of things, because obviously the Stoics taught that virtue is the only good. And that's an extremely freeing kind of way to view the world. It's like, okay, well, the only good that I should work towards is virtue. But when I was thinking about this last year, when I was kind of transitioning back into the podcast, doing more episodes, I was really wondering how the Stoics think about attaining the right judgment about virtue, right? Because for Christians, it's you have the Word of God, you have the Bible. That's where you can learn how to be virtuous, right? And through personal revelation as well. And you can correct me on any of that, but for the Stoics, I haven't yet figured out, did they believe that virtues come from God or nature? Did they always exist? Is virtue something that has always existed? Or is it something that we as human beings make up for ourselves?
I think the Stoics would say that virtues are ingrained in nature. They in a way, and we can go back to God again and theology again, because everything starts there. God as reason, as logos, cannot be anything else but good. You cannot, reason in itself, logic in itself, cannot entail something cruel, something negative. So
because it's all that there is, right? It's the very world that we live in.
Yeah, reason, being structured, being system, being order, cannot contain anything base, anything bad, anything cruel. It must be good. So God is basically good. And since we are ingrained with this God, we are also good. But we don't always live out and practice this good. And that is why we need training. We need to train to become what we have always been intended to be. So for Epictetus, becoming a human being is to return to the theological intentions from God, what God has always intended a human being to be. So a human being, the Greek is anthropos. A human being for Epictetus is a normative term. We are all human beings, but we can lose our human beingness by behaving badly. And he says that very directly. By doing adultery with your wife, with your neighbor's wife, by seeking just riches or punishing your slave, you are destroying the anthropos in you. You are not longer entitled to call yourself by this beautiful name anthropos, human being, if you do practice these things, because it is a part of your ingrained nature to be good, and that is the only true value which you should seek in life, to possess and be and become the human being that in nature has intended you to be. So virtue has always been there, and it is the start and it is the goal. And on the way, where we are in the middle of that, and we are striving to become the goal which we are from the start intended to be.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense now, because it's almost as if our job is to move away from the animalistic body side of our being and try and listen to or tap into or train the part of us that already has virtue. And about a week ago, I was having a conversation with one of my friends, and he's read a bit of Stoicism, but he like me is very much, questioning all these things at the moment, trying to really figure out what life is. And we had this conversation. He started to describe to me this theory, and he said, you're probably going to think this is crazy, but I'm going to give you this theory, and I want your thoughts on it. And he started saying, it's almost as if in life we are kind of wrestling there's like a battle going on between the body, which is like an animal, and the mind, which is like everything that is good about us, right? And he's describing this, and I said to him, you're literally describing Stoicism, because it is kind of like a negotiation or a wrestling between the body, which wants all of the animalistic desires and pleasures and all that sort of stuff, and the mind, which, if you can listen to it and tap into it well enough, the soul, you can start to move in the direction of better virtue, right?
Yeah, and that's a good picture. This the kind of the bestial aspects of our body. But the interesting thing is that Epictetus and the Stoics, they do not blame the body for this for it being as it is. They blame always the soul, because everything you do is filtered through the hegemonic con in your soul, your rational principle. So the body, in a way, does not do anything on its own. It is you with your value system which make the body do as it does. So if your body longs for sexual pleasures, it is because you in your soul has decided that this is the value you want to pursue. And if your body craves for food, that is because you in your value system, in your soul, has said that to yourself that this is the value which you want to pursue. But these values can be changed. It is up to you to decide the value system which you want to live by. So you can dismiss this craving for sexuality or for food or for wealth or whatever, because it is up to you to create your value system. And again, that is you hear the slave talking here. It is he has become his own slave master. He is not longer made to be obedient to external masters. He is the self-authoritative master in his own life.
Yeah. Dan, that sounds like some freedom that I think we all really, really want. Yeah. I guess I only have a couple more questions for you. Well, that's an understatement. I have many more questions for you, but I want to be respectful of your time. The first one has to do, and I'm just going to write down here logos, because I really want to make sure that I ask you about that after this. But in Marcus Aurelius, he talks about this idea of, don't worry about how things are going to turn out, because today you're going to face the day with the same reasoning powers that you had yesterday and the day before. And there's a lot of phrases that he used that really make you think, yeah, I don't need to worry about what's happening out there. Obviously, I need to worry about what's happening in here, because what happens out there will work out for my good if I can focus on what is fundamentally important. My own personal journey in the past few months has been one of trying to look at all of the things that I can release from my life, so that I have more time for focusing on the very, very important things that actually make a difference. And this is an idea that's talked about in the Bible as well, with the passage, consider the lilies of the field, hey, God's going to provide for nature. and you're not separate to nature. So why do you think that he hasn't provided for you when you're like the most incredible creature in nature, right?
Yeah.
Is there a crossover here between having sort of what I call the Stoic cosmic confidence, this idea that things will work out for good if you focus on what's most important, and the Christian idea of God will provide for you if you just focus on him and doing good?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is one of the clear crossovers between Christianity and Stoicism. This notion of God or nature always leading to the beneficence of the one who has decided upon on the right system of values. So I think that is very, very correct. And the passage you mentioned from Matthew 6 about the lilies of the field, it's very. I think the Stoics will subscribe to that. How can you be so anxious about your material well-being when you see how God takes care of all the rest of nature? He will never forget you. That Epictetus will subscribe to that kind of overall cosmic confidence, as nice to put it.
And when I think about that, the biggest argument that somebody could put up against an idea like that is, well, what about poverty? What about horrible situations in life? There's not everything is perfect. And if you just leave it up to the world, nothing is just good. But is it almost a question of aims and goals? Because like for Epictetus, his only aim, it seems, was to be the master of his soul, to be completely free by going only inward, right? And that was his aim. Do you think that the different aims that we have in, say, Western culture, consumerism, I want all of this stuff, does that get in the way of us seeing the true power of that kind of theory?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, should also remember, and this is an aspect of God again, the theology again. As we said, since God is logos, order, structure, reason for the Stoics, that means that not only is it good in terms that you should seek for yourself what is the true good, but you in order to become this true Stoic, you have to do good to others. So it goes both ways. So Epictetus and the other Stoics have often been accused of being ethical egoists, only think about themselves as long as they themselves have this inner peace, the Stoic peace. They don't care about the rest of humanity and the rest of nature. But that is plenty wrong, because the Stoics would be the first to stand up to defend the rights of others and to help others in their needs, because that was the flip side of the coin. You should not only be good to yourself in terms of finding the right value system. These values have to be lived out to the benefit of others. So the Stoics were famous for being the ones who spoke out against cruelty. And Epictetus has several examples of these Stoic heroes who, in defiance of threats from the emperor and all other important people, stood up for the truth and for the benefit of others. So the Stoics have also have this collective social responsibility as a part of their sense of being a good human being. It is not possible to be a good human being by living solely on your own. You have to benefit others.
Yeah, this now makes a lot of sense to me. It's really that's a brilliant way to think about it, because it's almost as if, okay, well, why are you asking why God is doing all of this poverty and stuff? Like, you created this, you're the humans, you're the ones not taking care of everybody that you could take care of, and you have the spark of the divinity, which means that you have a responsibility to be a cosmopolitan, to go and take care of these people who need it. So stop blaming God, blame yourself, go do it. That's a brilliant way to think about it. And you mentioned the logos there. We've talked about it a couple of times in this conversation. the logos has been kind of one of the really fascinating areas of discussion for me. I'm really trying to get my head around it, because obviously in the Bible, there is that verse, God was the Word and the Word was good. So we talk about how the logos is our ability to use words to describe the world around us, to become smarter. And then I think about, studies that have showed that people in jail, on average, have lower vocabularies than people who don't go to jail, right? So it's like you think about that, and it's like, well, does that mean that if I am able to just learn more and more words and to be able to put those words into intelligible sentences that help me to understand the world and to understand how to act in the world, is the word the key towards developing greater virtue? And I think about that, and could you describe the way that you see the logos? Because we could just say it's the same as nature and everything like that, but there's something different about it, right?
Yeah, logos, as you say, is a very complex term, and it goes to the heart of all ancient Greek philosophy, and I guess all philosophy in whatever context, because logos for the Greeks is so elastic, as we started talking about earlier. It can be tied or pulled in all kinds of directions, because it encompasses everything. It has to do with rationality, it has to do with structure, it has to do with order, it has to do with words. And I can use the system or the structure of philosophy which the Stoics themselves used in ancient times. They divided the field of philosophy into three parts. It was the study of physics, and the study of logics, and the study of ethics. So the physics is when you try to understand the physical nature around us, the nature as a whole. And then we have the ethics, when we try to understand the joint community life of people living together, what should be the way we live together. And then we have, of course, logic, how our minds, how our brains function. And what ties all these three fields together is, of course, logos, because the Stoics see the same kind of structure and order and system in nature at large, that is physics, and also in the kind of structured life human beings should live together, that is ethics, and also in kind of structure which reigns in a human being, in our minds and in our bodies, then that is logic. And they have many subdivisions for all of these three basic divisions again. But the point is that logos is the thing that ties everything together. There is structure, there is order in everything. Then we see how this logos becomes a very, very diverse term, which ties together all the reality for the Stoics. And as you mentioned, the words are very important for the Stoics. They are, I think they are the branch of philosophy which made the science of grammar. It was the Stoics that invented the science of grammar, and trying to understand the logical structure of human speech, of human discourse. And I also found very deep meaning in individual words. Words did not have their form by accident. It was always some kind of hidden philosophical meaning in the etymology of words. And just to do an example, for example, the name Zeus is not a random name for the highest god. He must be termed Zeus. And then they use the inflection of the word Zeus to make their point, because in the accusative, I don't know if your listeners or viewers are familiar with inflection languages, but nouns in ancient Greek could be inflected in different cases, and then the name Zeus, when his name comes in another case, named the accusative, it can have two forms. It can be Dia, which is the same name Zeus, but it's just in another case. But then the Stoics see here a connection to another word, which is dia, which means through or because of. And then the Stoics thought, oh, Zeus must be named Zeus, or then dia, as I said, in accusative, because then he is the reason, the because of element of why everything exists. He is the one through which everything exists. So they found deep meaning in actual words. So words are not random. They are hidden. There is hidden etymological, philosophical meaning in all kinds of words. So the Stoics are incredibly interesting, trying to see logos being a part of not only on the big scale, but also down to individual minute words.
Yeah. That's such fascinating stuff, and I'm very interested in this. And the way that I kind of think about it is, I mean, bring it to a very practical modern sense. It's like, if you don't understand language, then you're not going to get very far in this world, and you're not going to understand that much. But let's say you learnt all of the vocabulary or the logos of financials and accounting. Well, you would all of a sudden have very many excellent abilities to handle your wealth correctly. And let's say you learned the logos or the words of law, then you would be able to put forward an excellent argument. And that's why to the Stoics, logic was so important, because it was our ability to use words effectively in the world. And yeah, that's such a fascinating topic. But you know, Glenn, I want to thank you so much. This has just been seriously one of my favorite conversations ever. I've really enjoyed this, and I hope that you'll come back on the podcast many more times to share your wisdom.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Practical Stoic Podcast. If you'd like to sign up for email updates, join my Patreon meetup groups that we hold weekly, or if you'd like to offer feedback or suggestions for future guests or topics on the show, then you can head to simonjedrew.com. There you'll also find information about how we can work one-on-one together with my alignment coaching, based around the philosophical principles found in Stoicism. Finally, if you are on Facebook, then I'd love to see you in our group, the Practical Stoic Mastermind. But hey, I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I'll talk to you next time.